Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast normally about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and today we're going to be talking about the environment in Costa Rica instead. Specifically, we are asking the question, is Norway promoting oil and gas expansion in Costa Rica with a Costa Rican ex-environment minister who could profit more than the country itself if oil and gas expansion goes ahead? Roberto Dobles was former Minister of Environment and Energy between 2006 and 2009 in Costa Rica. Following his time as minister, he cut a deal with an American company, Black Hills Energy, for a huge share of oil and gas profits from the company's proposed oil and gas plants in Costa Rica. After those plans fell through, he sued Black Hills for the compensation he said he is owed. More money than Costa Rica itself would have made in royalties had Black Hills' plans proceeded. Recently, ex-Minister Dobles attended a meeting between the current Costa Rican government and the Norwegian government about Norway helping Costa Rica explore for oil and gas in the country. Dobles and the Main Business Association brought before Costa Rica's government data from the very company he is suing to try and convince the authorities and the public there's a lot of oil and gas in Costa Rica. Under those claims, Costa Rica asked Norway to help in a diplomatic meeting with Dobles' attendance. Not being a Costa Rican official, the presence of Dobles in that meeting is difficult to explain, and the Costa Rican government's push and Norway's participation in the meeting could benefit Dobles' lawsuit for compensation from Black Hills. Sound above board? The question remains, why would Norway work with someone like Dobles, and is Norway promoting oil and gas in Costa Rica? Promoting oil and gas in Costa Rica would be at odds with Norway's insistence that they are climate champions. At the recent UN climate conference, the Norwegian environment minister said that the commitment to transition away from fossil fuels in our energy systems is groundbreaking and cannot be misunderstood. Not by governments, not by markets, not by anyone. We talk with Carolina Sanchez, a climate change communications professional in Costa Rica, about what's happening, how Norway is involved, and what you can do in Canada to help shine a light on this issue. For context, Sierra Club Canada is part of an international campaign against the plans of the Norwegian state oil and gas company, Equinor, to expand oil and gas production overseas. In Canada, Equinor is proposing the Bay du Nord oil project, which, if it succeeded, could do irreparable damage to local ecosystems and our climate. As part of that international campaign, and this podcast, we are looking into the Norwegian government and their majority state-owned oil and gas company, Equinor's actions and climate hypocrisy. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other action items and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media. You can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And this podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Carolina, welcome to the podcast today. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for having me. We appreciate that.
Tell me a bit about yourself and what brought you to this sort of work and how you've come to work on this issue.
Well, I am a comms specialist, and when I was young trying to decide what to study, I had a really hard time trying to figure out what I wanted to study. And then this very, very cool professor I had at the time told me, what is it that you really want to do in life? And my answer at 17 was, I want to change the world. And that took me to comms. And eventually, in part because I'm Costa Rican, I guess we kind of are born with a little bit of a green mindset in our DNA, and we have a history of conservation, a history of a relationship with nature that has always been very important for me. And thankfully, that took me to working with energy. And I started working almost 15 years ago with solar energy in Costa Rica. And eventually that developed into combining my two passions, which is communications and energy. I've worked in sustainability and different types of projects in Costa Rica, but also regional in Latin America and in the Caribbean, helping communicate the importance of renewables in a certain way. But eventually that also took me to fossil fuels and the need of communications and why we need to leave fossil fuels behind and find new ways of energy and not only new ways, but also how can we transition in a just way to new types of systems and energy systems more specifically.
It's funny that funneling that happens, you get involved with one thing environmentally and then somehow you wind up on climate change and ultimately on these issues. I find it's a similar thing. A lot of people have told me there's this kind of movement in that direction. I guess on that note, today we're going to be talking a little bit about Norway and some of their actions internationally. There's been some really big news recently on this, in fact, and I'd just like to get into what is Norway doing in Costa Rica? What is their activity at the moment?
Well, it's important to build up a little bit of context in the sense that Costa Rica has traditionally been renewable country. We are almost 100% renewable in electric wise, right? We have our electricity has been for many decades now based on hydroelectricity, but now we also have geothermal, which is very important here, and wind and solar are growing. But energy wise, we are not that renewable because, like in many, many countries in the world, transportation is a big issue for us, right? And transportation makes our energy matrix be almost half based on fossil fuels. Now, we don't do any type of fossil fuel exploitation in Costa Rica. We import all of our fossil fuels. And recently, in the past several years, the idea of maybe doing some exploration and exploitation in our country has unfortunately taken some force. We have cases like Guyana, Latin America, or in the region that are putting ideas in politicians and business people that we could potentially make a lot of money with this old school business, right? And that has been unfortunately gaining momentum in Costa Rica. Economic wise, everybody's hurting post pandemic. And so there's enough circumstances to make people believe that this could be useful. In that sense, Norway hasn't really been active in Costa Rica in that sense, but our politicians are using Norway as an excuse as to why we should do this in Costa Rica and how we could actually do it in a sustainable way. So we have in the current administration in the country, unfortunately, again, is not so environmentally oriented like we have had in the past. And what they have been promoting is consultation with Norway so that Norway can help us define how much oil and gas, mostly gas, is what it's being promoted. So what they say is Norway is going to help us figure out how much gas we have. And if it is something worth exploiting, they're going to help us do it in the most sustainable way possible. Because Norway is a champion in the world. This is their words, not mine. A champion in how to actually use their natural resources in a sustainable way. So what has happened is that in the past year, the government has actually held several meetings with Norway politicians and institutions to let them know what we have and what we know about possibility of reserves in the country and ask for help from them, technical help and financial help to do what they call non-intrusive exploration in Costa Rica. We had some exploration back in the 90s mostly, and previously I think in the 60s and 70s in Costa Rica too. And it was mostly studies-based geology studies based on the type of soil we have. And there's ideas that there might be or that there is some oil and gas under our soil, both inland and offshore. But we've never had exploration that can confirm what kind of reserves or if they're commercially useful for the country. So that's where the name of Norway is being thrown out, right? They know how to do this, right? And that's why we're asking help from them. And our politicians tend to compare our countries a lot. We have a similar population, Norway and Costa Rica. We have a similar reputation in certain things too, but we don't have a similar political system. We don't have a similar social system necessarily.
Mhm.
So it's not who we would, in many other senses, compare ourselves to. But that's more or less what's happening with Norway and Costa Rica right now.
It's an interesting point because I had a chat on just another episode of the podcast with somebody in Norway about how I grew up in a province that very much was always, we were like, we should be doing what Norway's doing. We should be doing what Norway's doing. And again, it wasn't really going to work for us because we're not actually similar in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of differences. And also, like, maybe we could have managed things better. This was in the past to a certain extent, but that didn't happen. So that leaves things where they are as well. It's fascinating that Norway kind of gets held up as this example of how to do something that's really bad for the climate in the theoretically good way to do it. That seems like a common theme I hear from everybody.
It is. And the crazy thing for me as a Costa Rican is that to know that we actually have done really good things as a country for the environment. We not only have been mostly renewable for the last 30 years or so, electrically wise, we have very good coverage electric wise too. Pretty much everybody in Costa Rica has access to electricity. But also we recover our forests and our natural coverage of the country in the last 30 years too, but in a big way, because we created a lot of national parks in the 80s, because we've been working with different ways to get paid for conserving our nature and our parks. And actually we are champions in reforestation, for example. and and not only that, but I also still believe that most of us in our country understand the value of a sustainable living and maintaining a good relationship with the natural world. So it is sort of frustrating. And we call it a little bit is a third world mindset sometimes that unfortunately Latin American countries we tend to get stuck in, because we tend to think that we need to look at others to tell us how to do things when we have the knowledge. We've had it for millenniums. We have it even before Christopher Columbus came to our land. There's knowledge on how to live a good life in our lands. And I don't see why we need others with different circumstances to come tell us how we should do things or be compared to. And I think that I just wanted to make a point there. That's really important when it comes to energy transition, to this big word that, both politicians and organizations like to throw around. And I think we need to understand that there's not one recipe for a just energy transition for the world. That's never going to happen. There's not one recipe for anything around the world. Everything should be more local based. Every region, every country needs to look at what works for them, what resources they have, how their society is built up, and then plan what is the transition for a better future. Because the truth is that it doesn't seem like we're going to have a better future the way we are going right now. But it should be something that everybody should be empowered, or every region and country should be empowered to understand that the solutions they don't have to come from other big countries. We can build them up based on what our context and our reality is. So it's not only frustrating on the fossil fuel specific subject, but in general, that we have to make those type of comparisons.
Well, because there's a lot of things that you've said about what Costa Rica is doing that I'm like, well, Canada could learn a lot from that. You know, like we're not. I think you had a moratorium too on oil and gas expansion. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that, right? Like that's still up for debate in Canada, right? Like there's a lot of things too that are happening in communities, particularly a lot of Indigenous communities, where they're looking back actually on practices that again they've had for a very long time, and everybody's starting to weigh up to the fact that, well, yeah, we should probably have been learning from that, not trying to erase that as a country and adopt these very sort of hyper consumerist and very destructive ways of looking at natural environment. So I see a lot actually that we should be learning, not
You make a very important point on the context in Costa Rica that I failed to mention, is the fact that we have had a moratorium on oil and gas exploration and exploitation for
Mhm.
at least 10 to 12 years now, or the last three administrations. And currently, there's a moratorium until 2050, but that's a presidential decree. So it can be taken away at any time by the current president or any future president. So that makes it really important in the context because we already made a big decision on this sense. And now there's voices that want to take us back. So part of what we're trying to do is to actually have a law that prohibits permanently exploration and exploitation in our territory. And it is my understanding that we would be the first country to actually have such a law. Belize has a similar law, but only for offshore currently. But they do have a law that was voted by the people through a referendum to prohibit any kind of exploration or exploitation in their ocean, in their Caribbean ocean. So I think that part was important, yes, in the context of what's happening.
I'm curious to dive in a little bit. I know there's been a lot of recent news items, particularly around a particular ex-environment minister, as I take it, connections to oil and gas industry, and he's been at these meetings with Norway. What's happening there? Who is this person, and sort of why are they in a meeting room with Norway and other people chatting about this?
Well, that's why we want to know why was he in those meetings, but we haven't gotten an answer as to why yet. But
Mhm.
this is a former environment and energy minister. Our ministry is combined. Environment and energy is under the same institution.
Mhm.
And he has been vocal about exploring for gas and oil in Costa Rica forever since he was minister, I believe, over 20 years ago or so.
Mhm.
And he has been a minister actually in two different occasions, and he was also looked into some other issues with mining problems in Costa Rica. We had a big mining issue several years ago where they wanted to permit gold mining in the north of Costa Rica, and several environmental organizations were able to stop that, but it still became an issue because then illegal mining happened there. But he
Mhm.
was also involved in that scandal at the time.
Mhm.
This minister, what we now know and came out in the press this week, is that he actually had a contract with Black Hills Corporation in the United States, and Black Hills had in the early 2000s they had a concession to do exploration in Costa Rica. He had a contract to pretty much, and it clearly says, do all the lobbying necessary to make this happen, right? For
Mhm.
them to actually be able to do exploration and eventually exploitation. Not only it's clear on what his duties were, it also has some really interesting points on how much money he was going to make from this. And he was promised under contract at 3% of royalties from from whatever production eventually happened in Costa Rica. And it is now not our understanding that not even Costa Rica was going to get a 3%, like the government
So
wasn't
this
going to
one
have such a
person,
sweet,
wow.
was gonna make more money out of this business than what the country was gonna make. And we know that in general, the countries don't make that much either from their
No.
contracts with
Mhm.
oil companies. And Not only he had all those benefits, but the funny part is that we know all of this story and we have access to this contract because he's currently suing Black Hills in the United States because they did not continue with the process. They didn't continue with the process because the government, in several reasons, but mostly the political environment changed. And
Mm-hmm.
it changed to a new administration where they were not open to do this, to do exploration or to go into this subject. And that's when the first moratorium came to be. So Black Hills probably did not find it commercially useful to be having a fight in such a small country where they didn't even know how much we had and if it was worth the fight.
Yeah.
So they step away. But they also step away because they were asked to do a environmental impact assessment, and they didn't do it the way our institutions wanted them to do it. It did not have the impact of actually on the ground perforations, for example. And so it was never accepted, and that became sort of a hurdle there for the process and for the company. And this former minister is suing them because they did not continue that. They didn't do what they were asked for, and therefore,
Mm-hmm.
in his mind, his contract was not. It shouldn't have been stopped at the time. But he's also taking advantage now. Well, he already sued them, I believe, in Colorado, and he lost.
Mm-hmm.
But then Black Hills Corporation used to be or bought Malon Oil. Malon Oil was the one that had the concession. And the owner of Malon also sued Black Hills Corporation and won in a different court than what originally the Costa Rican former minister did. So when he says that the former owner of Malon Oil wins in a different court, he sue again in this different court, which is in, I believe, South Dakota. So that's the process that he currently has opened. And it came to be news this week because a newspaper in South Dakota published about that last year, and because the legal system in the US makes it transparent and available to see certain cases, and that's how the different journalists were able to see what kind of contract he had and what he's been doing. Now, to land back in our subject here,
Mm-hmm.
what's interesting is he's taking advantage of the political environment that we currently have, where again they're interested in this. So he's trying to demonstrate that there's options and that they shouldn't have abandoned the idea of exploring in Costa Rica. And he's using the fact that the government is asking Norway for help as proof of why they shouldn't have ended his contract the way they did. So
So he's directly
again,
using this in the legal case. Like this is not
it's
like undivided, but then he's also in the meeting room with. Okay, I can continue. Sorry,
is
I'm trying to.
correct.
Yeah.
So he is not currently part of the government, but earlier last year, the Union of Chambers and Associations of Costa Rica, so a very big business union, let him sort of direct a project to present an energy policy for the country. And they presented this to the government. And the energy policy that he wrote says we should do exploration and exploitation. So in theory, he was invited to the meeting with Norway as a representative of the business sector of the Union of Chambers and Associations of Costa Rica, which now everybody's saying we don't know, we don't have anything to do with this person, right? But he was, and we know he was in the meeting with Norway, kind of presenting the numbers he has, which are not public numbers, on how much we could potentially exploit in Costa Rica. And they say that we have, that it'd be millions of dollars that they could make in Costa Rica,
Yeah.
which there's no public information of that, of really how much Black Hills found or what at the end they came up with our potential reserves are.
Yeah.
But after all this came out in the news this week, nobody has really answered why was he there in that meeting. We know he probably won't be anymore in the meetings with Norway, but he was. He was there, I guess, presenting the case and trying to convince Norway institutions to help the country.
Just to recap, so you've got an ex-environment minister who was being paid to lobby on oil and gas, comes to a meeting with Norway to say, let's go to Costa Rica and let's explore for oil and gas, when with private information from the company that he's suing for his profits, and he's using the excuse that Norway is interested as a result of this meeting as evidence in his lawsuit against the company so he can make millions of dollars. Like, this is what it sounds like. I'm not going to claim to be a legal expert, but that sounds like a summary.
That's correct. Yes, that's exactly right. Again,
Okay.
yeah, legally wise, really, we haven't found anything illegal, or is not the subject whether it's illegal or not. It's just the interest, right? The fact that it doesn't seem that he's doing it for country interests, but personal interests, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I can't speak obviously to the Costa Rican legal system or even the US one, but I mean, if it's not illegal, it sounds like it kind of should be. It's just the amount of his self-interest in all of that. And so I'm curious because I want to read a quote that just came from the latest UN climate conference, because there's something that we've done a lot on similar issues in Canada, and we've often talked with people in Norway, and we've heard back a consistent response from the government in Norway that they do not promote fossil fuels overseas, that's their main company, which they do own a majority share in, which is Equinor, does that, but they as a government aren't responsible for that sort of thing. Obviously, all of this sounds contrary to that, but also at the most recent UN climate conference, the Norwegian climate and environment minister said on the agreement to transition away from fossil fuels, even though we and many others like Samoa wanted stronger language, the commitment to transition away from fossil fuels in our energy systems is groundbreaking and cannot be misunderstood, not by governments, not by markets, not by anyone. Why is Norway now taking a role in exploring for oil and gas, if that's what?
Well, I can't speak for what Norway is or is not doing, but we know how our country and our politicians are using Norway's name.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a very important thing nowadays, where everything is so global, because really we don't have proof that Norway has accepted any help. We know that they received our politicians, we know that they've met, and they have heard what our politicians have to say and what they are asking for, but nothing has come out of them accepting any kind of help yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that if this is the presence or the ideas that they want to put out there globally of what Norway is doing, then they should be very careful of how their name is being used in countries, especially in the global south, as an example, and as how we should follow their steps. Because there's a lot of things that we continue to say this, there's a lot of things that we could actually learn or work with Norway to be more like them, like in sustainable cities or sustainable mobility and transportation, for example. And that would be a better international cooperation, to actually work under what this Norwegian politician was saying in the conference. But the reality is their name is being used for the opposite. Their name is being used, and it's not only Costa Rica and other countries in Latin America. It's also something that those in favor of new oil and gas say, we can do it the way Norway did. We can make money the way Norway did. Actually, in one of the articles of this week, the president said, our Costa Rican president said, We are asking the ones that know. We are asking Norway because they have been able to do exploitation in the North Sea without any kind of impact, which we know is not true. There's always impact.
There's always impact.
So I don't know whether it's contradictory or not based on whatever they end up answering to Costa Rica.
Yeah.
But it is important for them to know that this is how their name is being used. And if this is not how they want the world to see them, then they should speak up. They should speak up and say, no, that's not what we believe anymore. That's not the route we want to take anymore. We agree with leaving fossil fuels behind. And please don't throw our name out there like that,
Yeah.
But that hasn't happened either, though. Hopefully it will, but that's they don't speak up in that sense either. So again, I can't point fingers as to whether Norway is actually gonna help Costa Rica or not, but they should definitely speak up about the way their name's being used as an excuse in our country and many other countries in the global south.
Yeah, because I hear, and in a slightly different way, I talking to folks in, for instance, Argentina and Brazil have said similar things that, it's like, well, there's these projects being pursued often with very little public consultation, in those cases by Equinor, not by the Norwegian state, quote unquote, although again, they own 67% of the company. So you can argue, yes, it is the Norwegian state, right? That they're pursuing all these things often, local communities aren't consulted at all. We've had problems in Canada as well with this, where a lot of Indigenous communities weren't properly consulted on a recent project, where the risks were severely underplayed to the point at which, like, what was supposed to be like a fraction of a percent of a chance of a major oil spill that the company said was going to happen is actually a 16% chance of an oil spill when independent scientists did the actual analysis, right? So there's definitely all this misinformation going out, all of this omission going out, all this lack of public consultation happening. And again, Norway's name is stamped on that, whether they want it to be or not, which raises that question. Why aren't they saying anything to the contrary then? If this is happening, why aren't they? Was this the only meeting that they had?
This is the only meeting that we know about and that we have data or the minutes for it, and we know who participated and what the country or what the politicians in Norway answered. And that's because Norway does have a transparent system in a way that unfortunately we in Costa Rica don't have, and that's public information. But the news or some of the interviews that happened during this week when all this scandal came out in the press, one of the politicians that we know participated in this meeting that we know about, said that there has been more meetings, that there was at least 3, is what he said in an interview. But we don't currently have any information on Norway's side or our side about those other meetings, who participated in those other meetings, or what was said. So they did say, the current environment minister said that Norway has not answered whether they're going to help us or not. I hope that now they won't, or they will speak up on the contrary and say, yeah, we'll help you, but we'll help you on the sustainable things that you really need. But apparently there has been more than one meeting. Yes.
Yeah, this is so. I was reading some of the articles on this, and I wanted to ask you about that because that came up, and again, I wasn't sure if that was. It sounds like that's something that broke actually, as this story broke, that there was more than one meeting. I could see like one meeting, they come, they hear something out, and they go, okay, you know what, we're not going to do this. But it's a little bit different when you start hearing, oh, there's follow-up meetings happening, right? Like that can be. I'm curious, delving a little bit more into some of the ways in which Norway could be a positive force in the world, because we have seen they have a lot of expertise in renewable energy, for instance, right? Like even the state oil company has those expertise. What other specific things that you think they could be doing or should be doing to sort of help on a world stage?
Well, like I was saying, our main problem in Costa Rica is transportation, and it is the main problem probably in most of the Latin American countries anyway. Not only on the fact that is fossil fuel based, but also on the way that we developed ideas of mobility. That maybe when we first built our roads and our public transportation, we were not thinking of that. Now, Costa Rica, for example, is moving very fast into electrical transportation. That's very important here, but that's only one part of what needs to change, right? Public transportation, for example, is very important for an actual transition away from fossil fuels. And we really haven't been able to work on our public transportation the way we should, like many other Latin American countries, except maybe Medellin and some cities that have actually moved forward on better ideas in that sense. And it's my understanding that Norway also has a strong EV culture in general, right? And they're
Hmm.
working a lot in sustainable mobility in general, not only electrical mobility or electric mobility, but just the general idea of how, for example, bicycles or pedestrians and other types of urbanism ideas
Hmm.
of to have better cities in that sense. And that could be something that will be more important for the global south, especially in Latin America, to help through international cooperation, to help us work towards that, to help us build capacity, knowledge on those type of things, but also in general sustainable cities. For example, I think I was reading that there was a project, or I can't remember right now if it's in process, but for cities in Norway to become more sustainable with all these ideas of, having more green spaces, of working on the temperature of the cities based on including nature based solutions or other type of projects that are actually more on the side of being resilient to what we know is coming because of climate change. So that will be more important for our countries to share knowledge and capacity building to actually do more mitigation and adaptation of our cities, of our coasts, of our transportation in general. So I think at least those two areas, sustainable cities and sustainable mobility, is something that I will be happy to get help from Norway.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and there's all those considerations. I think it's funny sometimes we boil this down to like in Canada, at least to the debate around electric vehicles and like, do they work or don't they? Do they work in the cold? And it's like, well, it's more than just a question of that. It's like the charging infrastructure and how much do we make that cost and how do we encourage things like public transit? How do we build things that are going to improve that? How do we improve rail service? There's all these things that it's not just like there's one solution. It's like, how do you build these systems? And we build these systems in order to provide better solutions. And part of that's electric vehicles, and part of that's the public transport, and part of that's encouraging biking and stuff like that, which again, like all those things also come with a bunch of other benefits that aren't even factored into that debate, like less pollution in the air that
Correct.
causes asthma, right? Like this is
Hmm.
a huge impact. I'm curious. I was initially going to ask you, with regards to this issue, what should we be doing to help, maybe specifically for people in Canada who are going to mostly be the people listening to this podcast? I want to ask that, but then I also want to ask, where should we be going as Canadians to learn more about what Costa Rica is doing and what we should maybe be adopting?
I think that it's really important to mention that Canada and Canadians in general are a very important part of our tourist sector, and Costa Rica depends a lot on its tourism, and we also try to build sustainable tourism. A lot of we know that most of the tourists that come to our country, they come to our national parks, they come to do bird watching, to interact or to see in a respectful way, hopefully biodiversity and more of the natural and cultural things that make Costa Rica an interesting touristic destination. And Canadians, we have a lot of expats in Costa Rica that are from Canada too. And that's also important and interesting, because most of the time, hopefully most of the time, but as far as I know, what they do is that they come and they adapt to our pura vida living, right? Which is a more slow type of living, more nature based or in harmony with nature, and less based on economics and money type of living. And so I think that it's really important for Canadians that I believe already like our country a lot to, number one, raise their voices as to this is why we like Costa Rica, because we need to make that clear in our country. It is important that our politicians understand that that tourists come to Costa Rica because we are sustainable, because we take care of nature, and that's one of the main reasons. Because they like to say, which I think I didn't mention this before, but they like to say that exploration is not going to have any effect on tourism, right? That being hypocritical about what we promote internationally and then doing exploitation of oil and gas is not going to affect our reputation. And it's not going to make tourists come less to Costa Rica, but we know it's not true. We know they come to see our national parks and our nature, and it will be very helpful to hear from our fellow Canadians and defend that that's what they like about Costa Rica. That on one side, but also at the same time, that's hopefully a petition to make sure that that's what they come from, right? And to know that what they're coming is to help a country, because the beauty of tourism is that it's an industry that actually distributes wealth a lot, right? They come, and normally it's not to big hotels, but more local places, and they eat in local restaurants and then pay for local touristic experiences from different type of tour operators and things like that. And that promotes distribution of wealth. So hopefully also we love to continue seeing Canadians visit us, and hopefully most of them come with that mindset and understanding that what they're doing is helping a country that really believes in this, although our current politicians say something different, and that hopefully they help us keep preserving that 6% of biodiversity, because we are a very small country, but we have 6% of the world's biodiversity in our territory, which is a lot for the small territory we are. So hopefully, I guess what Canadians can do is learn about what we're trying to preserve here, why it's important for the region, for the world. We know that as a small country, we are not going to have a big impact on what happens in climate change or not, but we can be a great example. And that's kind of what we based everything we do on, is the example we want to be. And that helps us live better in our country, but also hopefully help other countries move in the right direction too. So learn about Costa Rica and the importance of keeping it as sustainable as possible, and hopefully also taking back home ideas as to how Canada can also live in more harmony with its nature, and in ways that are actually good for as much people as possible and not just a few, like what we know fossil fuel industry normally means, right? It's a benefit for the few.
Yeah, it's something that Canada could do a much better job of, because the funny thing is, like, we have a lot of people argue that our overall emissions are smaller than some other big countries, and therefore we shouldn't have as much responsibility, even though our per capita, like our emissions per person, are huge, right? And we just actually found out that the emissions from the oil sands production is being underreported by like 6,000%. So like a factor of like,
wow,
at times like up to 6,000%. We literally, that I think just broke the day before this recording. The study actually came out, and and yet, Canadian politicians sometimes have to have that thing of, yeah, it's not just even about, like, even if you didn't have, and you have significant emissions, right? Like Canada has significant emissions, even if you didn't, you should still be the leader, because why does anybody, unless countries are, or if it's Costa Rica or Canada, coming up and showing these ways forward, how can we expect anybody else to do that? So I think it's really, yeah, really important. Any final notes before we end for today?
No, well, just that to not lose hope, I guess, for those of us that continue to work in this line, and to those of us that still believe that a better future is possible, and that the next generations can hopefully still survive in this planet. I know it seems sometimes frustrating, I think, the way things happened. What happened in Costa Rica this week is very frustrating to understand that those level of corruption and personal interest are what moves the world. And I bet in countries like Canada, it's probably even more frustrating because you're so big and you have so much more population that we do, that sometimes we feel like, why would I care if I am just this little drop in a huge ocean, right? And I can't really change anything. But I think that it's really important to now more than ever to not lose hope that that whatever you do does have an impact and can change the world, even if you're just a little drop in the ocean. So I guess that's what I would like to close with.
Thank you. That's really great for everybody listening. Carolina, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Connor, for having me. It was a pleasure to be here and to talk with you.
The end of each podcast episode is dedicated to answering your questions on the environment or on the work of Sierra Club Canada. If you have a question, send it in to us at info@sierraclub.ca and we'll be happy to answer it. We like to answer these questions in as much depth as possible, and we do have a bit of a time limit on how long the show can actually run for, and as a result, it may take a couple of episodes before we get back to your question. So if you've sent in a question and it doesn't get answered in this episode, please do stay tuned. It's going to be answered in a following episode. Answers to Q&A questions on the podcast are on behalf of Sierra Club Canada. They do not represent the views of our guests on the podcast. So our first question for today's episode is, why do we still allow so much traffic everywhere? This is complex, and there are a lot of different factors for this. I think part of it historically has been that we've built cities around the idea of vehicular transport rather than building them really around more public forms of transport. But it goes a bit further than that as well. The way we've built our economy at large and the way we have built communities has often left them reliant upon transport from other places for goods and commodities, but also people having to actually travel quite far to get the things that they need. And there are ways that we could start addressing this on a very fundamental level within communities, within cities. Again, localizing things so that people actually have, things in their neighborhood that they can walk to, that they can get, or that they can bike to, that they can get is one way to deal with this. And this actually ties in a bit to a question we had on a previous episode, which was about particularly electric vehicles and batteries. We were chatting in that episode about how while electric vehicles are part of the solution to reducing transport emissions, they're not the only solution, and they definitely shouldn't be like the basis for our entire approach to reducing emissions. Part of that also has to be around redesigning cities, redesigning communities, and providing alternatives and options and localized options for people. Better public transport is, of course, another aspect of how do we solve the problem of there being a bunch of traffic and a bunch of emissions related to that traffic. Building up public transport infrastructure has huge benefits for the climate. It also has huge benefits for people as well, who, especially people who can't necessarily go out and buy a car. And the reality is, unfortunately, that a lot of people do need to own a vehicle, whether they live rurally or in the city. They need it for work. They need it to go get supplies from places because, again, those supplies aren't localized and their work isn't localized. And if you grow up in a rural area like I did, you will run into people with trucks and with cars. And many of those people do, in fact, need those vehicles because there is no other way to get the supplies that they need. And because that mode of life is so dependent upon it. So there are different approaches depending upon where you are, and no one approach is perfect. How do we improve public transport? We are still going to need vehicles to some extent, so how do we allow people to buy EVs at cheaper prices? How do we make charging infrastructure for those EVs more accessible? And how do we create a new economy, as we talked about in the last episode, that actually, does things like recycles the batteries effectively from those electric vehicles so that we're not just throwing those in the trash afterwards. There's a lot of ways that we need to fix those things, and most of those things are systemic. I want to touch on something else here in this because I think that there's probably a lot of people who listen to all of this climate advocacy and worry about what's the impact going to be on their particular life. And part of the reason that they're worried is, they may spend, an hour in traffic every day just to get to a grocery store where they have to go to because that's where they can get cheaper groceries. And right now that's really a big issue for people. And then if they hear the idea that, oh, I might have to spend a huge amount on a new electric vehicle because, of a new regulation, that scares people. And I think part of the reason of that is not understanding a lot of the policies that are out there. For instance, bringing a mandate that new vehicles have to be electric isn't going to force everybody to have to switch out their vehicle overnight to an electric vehicle. There's a lot of people who just can't afford a new vehicle, period. But there are lots of ways that we can be doing policies as well, and there are policies to this extent, to a certain extent, that make it easier for people to buy electric vehicles. So that's one aspect of it. And to ultimately also bring more electric vehicles into the used market so that we have, cheaper electric vehicles in that market as well. I mean, ensuring that manufacturers can only build electric vehicles by its very nature does that, because now they have to focus on creating electric vehicles, and that ultimately benefits everybody down the line. But it doesn't mean that there's this massive change happening for everybody who owns a used vehicle overnight, or even people who own new vehicles overnight aren't having to change their entire lives. That focus only on that question also hinders progress, because for that person who's worried about that, who's waiting in traffic, having better options for them in where they live, where they can get supplies, actually use public transport effectively, those are also part of the solution. Those also help. And in rural areas, again, building up things like electric vehicle, infrastructure, the actual charging stations, the ways to bring down those sorts of costs and to make that life easier is important. We're going to run into a lot of things in Canada that are harder than elsewhere to do, just because we are very spread out. And it's important that we're supporting communities no matter where they are and no matter what problems that they're facing. So the simple question to why do we allow so much traffic everywhere is basically because we've created a system that makes that necessary for a lot of people, and unfortunately we need to change the system. So for those of you listening who maybe are worried about how policies to change that system might affect you, I mean, the idea behind the advocacy work that we do at Sierra Club Canada is to minimize individual impacts and to maximize the systemic changes, because at the end of the day, if we can change those systemic things, we can lower the traffic everywhere, and we can actually make people's lives hopefully a lot better in the process. And hey, listen, maybe you're listening to this podcast on broadcast radio in traffic, driving the used car. That's what you can afford to buy. And you're thinking, wow, there's all these systemic changes that need to happen. What am I supposed to do about that? And for too long, we've had corporations telling us that we individually need to change our entire individual lives, and that's the only way anything will change on climate change or emissions. And that's not true. In fact, the much easier thing that you individually can do if you want to do something on this issue, the much, much easier thing that doesn't actually cost us really anything, is just sharing information like this, talking to people about it, countering misinformation on climate policies with the people that you know in your life, and actually talking about what the realities are and what the solutions are. The systemic changes we make should be made to make everybody's life easier, as well as the climate easier to address. It doesn't mean we don't have to sacrifice anything. It doesn't mean that we don't have to change anything. And it doesn't mean that there won't be hardships in some of these things. But it does mean that by actually confronting the systemic things, which is often as easy as having a conversation about dispelling myths about these climate policies, that alone does more good than most of the things we individually will do in a day to try and help the environment. It doesn't mean those things are useless. It just means there's a lot more to be done that's a lot cheaper to do, that has much more to do with the discussions we're having and the policies we support and talking to our neighbors than it does to do with changing individual lifestyles. And I think, again, if you're sitting in that car listening to this, don't be ashamed. That's not the problem. Don't be ashamed of the fact that you're sitting in your car listening to this. Understand that actually that conversation you have with your neighbor later today, or with your friend, or with your coworker about the climate and about how important it is that we change things systemically, that's much more important. Just telling somebody, hey, did you hear that we do need to phase out fossil fuels, that LNG isn't green, that, hey, it's good if we have an emissions cap, things that hold that oil and gas industry to account for its share of the emissions, not just let them get away with it and put the weight on the rest of us to reduce our emissions individually. Maybe oil and gas, the industry, the largest emitting sector in Canada, should have to, pull the same weight on reducing their emissions, should be bound to pulling that same weight via a cap on emissions, as the rest of us are being asked to do. Many of us are happy to try and do. Things like that, that's much more important. So we also had another question to do with the previous episode of this podcast, which was on nuclear waste and how to dispose of it in Canada, and also the sort of history of the nuclear industry in Canada and some of the regulatory issues that are taking place, particularly around waste, and particularly around a proposed nuclear waste dump near the Ottawa River that is really not up to par with safety standards, and the placement is extremely problematic. So the question reads, one issue not discussed was what alternatives there might be for disposal or long-term storage of the Chalk River waste. I recall that one of the concerns raised is that the NSDF, that's Near Surface Disposal Facility, proponents and CNSC didn't offer other alternatives for consideration. Are there other options? So I'm not personally an expert on this, so I reached out to Ol Hendrickson, who's an ecologist, a former federal research scientist, and a chair of Sierra Club Canada's National Conservation Committee, and this is what Ol had to say. How should the federal government deal with its 80 years of nuclear waste, including that at the Chalk River Laboratories of the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited? Number 1, upgrade the Chalk River groundwater treatment facilities to fully capture the existing plumes from the leaking waste areas. Number 2, build additional modular above-ground storage units, essentially above-ground concrete structures, and transfer the buried radioactive waste that is the source of the plumes to these units. Number 3, stop shipping waste from other federal nuclear sites until a long-term management facility is in place. And just to quickly cut in here, the previous episode talks about why this particular facility is such a problematic location for this. Believe around number 4, initiate a search for a site for such a facility away from the Ottawa River, such as a below-ground vault that allows monitored retrievable storage that conforms to international safety requirements that can isolate long-lived radioactive waste containing alpha emitters and fission products from the biosphere for the duration of its hazard. Number 5, engage First Nations and local communities from the outset in site selection and facility design. Number 6, request an International Atomic Energy Agency Artemis integrated expert peer review to help with the search for a least bad way to address the current radioactive waste decommissioning and remediation liability, and that can deal with future waste management needs. Create a new body independent from the nuclear industry and private sector companies responsible for radioactive waste and nuclear facility decommissioning. Do not allow the AECL to issue a new government-owned contractor-operated contract when the current one expires next year. And so, again, I really encourage you, for context, to go back to our previous episode of the podcast. Do listen into it. Do get a sense for the issue. There are, as you probably have guessed from the answer to that question, a lot of issues around the way our nuclear waste is regulated in Canada and who is responsible for looking after it, and the safety standards that are being used not meeting the safety standards that are needed. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. Just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.